I want you to think about something for a moment. $15,000. Say that number out loud. $15,000. That is 6 months of rent for most Americans. That is a year of groceries for a family of 4. That is a used car. That is a child's first semester of college. That is a number that, when it appears on an official document addressed to your name and taped to your front door, makes your stomach drop in a way that nothing else quite does. Now imagine that $15,000 fine is for, and I want you to really hear this, a flower bed. Not a dangerous structure. Not a health hazard. Not a noise violation or zoning issue or anything that affected a single neighbor in any measurable way. A flower bed. Specifically, a raised garden bed I had built in my front yard using reclaimed cedar wood, planted with lavender, rosemary, sunflowers, and a small section of vegetables along the back. It was, by any reasonable measure, the nicest thing on our block. 3 of my neighbors had specifically complimented it. One of them had asked me for advice on building her own, but it was 4 inches taller than the HOA's maximum raised bed height of 12 inches, and it was planted with vegetables, which the HOA handbook, on page 4 to 7, in a subsection that I challenge any reasonable adult to find without already knowing it exists, described as a prohibited agricultural use in front yards. 4 inches too tall. A few tomato plants. $15,000. This is that story, and it ends in a place that I genuinely could not have predicted when it started. My name is Thomas. I have lived in my house in the suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina for 9 years. I bought it when I was 31, a young professional, first-time homeowner, genuinely excited about having outdoor space after years in apartments. I read the HOA documents when I moved in. I thought I understood the rules. I paid my dues on time every quarter without exception. I was, by every measure I could think of, a good resident. And for 7 years, nothing happened. I mowed the lawn. I repainted the front door in an approved color. I kept the driveway clean. I introduced myself to new neighbors. I attended one HOA annual meeting and sat in the back and said almost nothing. Normal. Unremarkable. Exactly the kind of resident every HOA claims to want. Then I built the garden bed. It started as a pandemic project. Spring of 2021. Stuck at home, looking at a strip of front yard that had never been much more than a patch of struggling grass under a partial shade tree, and thinking, I want to grow something. I spent 3 weekends building the bed. Cedar planks, corner posts, good soil mix, a drip irrigation line. I researched companion planting. I picked varieties that would do well in North Carolina heat. I was genuinely proud of it in a way that surprised me, the kind of satisfaction that comes from making something with your hands that is both beautiful and useful. My neighbor Dale, a retired teacher in his 70s who has lived on our street for 22 years, came over the first morning and stood looking at it for a long moment. Then he said it was the finest front yard improvement he had seen on this street in a decade. He asked me what variety of lavender I had used. 2 weeks after the garden bed was complete, I received my first violation notice. It was from the HOA compliance coordinator. Her name was Diane. I had seen her at the one annual meeting I had attended. She had given a 15-minute presentation on acceptable mailbox post colors that I had found difficult to stay focused on. The notice cited 2 violations: raised bed height exceeding 12 inches. Mine was 16, and prohibited agricultural use in the front yard. It requested that I bring the property into compliance within 30 days or face escalating fines beginning at $250. I read the notice. I measured the bed. 16 inches. She was right about that. I had not known about the 12-inch limit. I had not known about the agricultural use prohibition. I called the HOA office the next morning. I spoke with Diane directly. I was polite. I explained that I had not been aware of those specific provisions. I asked whether there was a variance process, whether I could apply for an exemption, whether there was any part to keeping the bed with some modifications. Diane said the rules were clear. The bed needed to come down or be reduced to compliance height. The vegetables needed to be removed entirely or relocated to the backyard. I said I understood. I asked for some additional time to figure out the best approach. She said she would note the conversation. And then she noted something else too, because what happened next was not the escalation process described in the notice. Over the next 4 months, while I was researching my options, consulting neighbors, considering whether to reduce the bed height or simply relocate it, Diane issued 11 additional violation notices for the same 2 violations, each one adding to a running fine total that was compounding under the HOA's penalty schedule. By month, for the total had reached $15,000. Not because I had ignored the notices, not because I had been defiant or aggressive or unreasonable, because a compounding fine schedule, applied to 2 ongoing violations over 4 months, had produced a number that looked like it belonged on a mortgage statement. I received the final notice on a Tuesday, $15,240, with a note that if payment was not received within 30 days, the HOA would initiate lien proceedings against my property. I sat at my kitchen table with that notice for a long time, and then I heard a moving truck outside. I looked out the window. The house next door, vacant for about 3 months since the previous owners had relocated, had a truck in the driveway, and someone was standing on the front lawn talking to the movers. I did not recognize him at first. He was in jeans and a casual shirt, helping carry a box, completely unremarkable looking. It was Dale, from across the street, who came over an hour later and mentioned it casually over the fence. "Did you meet the new neighbor yet?" he said. I said I had not. Dale smiled. "Might want to introduce yourself. That's James Whitfield. He just finished his 2nd term as mayor." I looked at the house next door. Then I looked at the $15,000 notice on my kitchen table. When we left off, I had a $15,000 HOA fine on my kitchen table and a former mayor moving in next door. I want to be honest with you about something before I tell you what happened next. My first instinct was not strategic. My first instinct was very human. I thought, here is a person with influence and connections and a public profile. Maybe he can say something, make a call, put some pressure on the HOA, get this resolved faster than I could resolve it on my own. That instinct was not wrong exactly, but it was also not quite right, because what actually happened was both simpler and more powerful than I had imagined, and it happened in a way I could not have scripted. I introduced myself to James Whitfield 2 days after he moved in. He was in his backyard in the early evening, assembling a patio chair with the focused irritation of someone who has not read the instructions and is now regretting that decision. I was on my side of the fence pulling weeds from a border planting. We made eye contact through the fence slats. He nodded. I nodded. I said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Thomas. I've been here about 9 years. He said, "James, good to meet you. Do you know anything about hex bolts? Because I'm having a genuinely terrible time with this chair." I laughed. I said I thought I had the right wrench size in my garage, and I would get it. I went over. We assembled the chair. We ended up talking for about 4 to 5 minutes in his backyard while his wife brought out 2 glasses of iced tea. He was, and I want to be clear about this because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds, a completely normal, decent human being having a normal conversation with a neighbor. No political energy, no performance. Just a guy who had just finished 2 terms running a mid-sized North Carolina city and was genuinely looking forward to having a backyard and a porch and a slower pace of life. About 20 minutes in, he asked a natural question. "What do you do? How long have you been here? Do you like the neighborhood?" And I told him the truth. I said the neighborhood was great. The neighbors were wonderful. But I was currently in the middle of something with the HOA that was causing me significant stress. He asked what kind of something. I told him about the garden bed, about the violation notices, about the compounding fines, about the $15,000. He listened without interrupting. He had the particular quality of attention that some people develop over years of sitting in meetings where they need to actually absorb what people are saying, genuine, focused listening, no performance of it. When I finished, he said, $15,000 for a garden bed. I said, "For a garden bed that is 4 inches too tall and has tomatoes in it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I see it?" We walked around to the front yard. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the raised bed. The lavender was in full bloom. The sunflowers were at the back. The tomatoes were doing exactly what tomatoes do in a North Carolina summer, aggressively, enthusiastically producing more tomatoes than one person can reasonably use. He stood there for a solid minute. Then he said, "This is a beautiful garden." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Did you know about the restrictions when you built it? I said, honestly, no. I had read the HOA documents when I moved in, but I had not known about the 12-inch limit or the agricultural use prohibition. When I received the first notice, I called immediately, tried to discuss options, and being told the rules were the rules. He nodded slowly. He said, I'm not on the HOA board. I'm just a resident now. But I'd like to come to the next board meeting if you don't mind, just to listen. Would that be all right with you? I said it would be more than all right. He said, in the meantime, have you talked to an attorney? I said I had not. The fine had felt so overwhelming that I had not known where to start. He gave me a name, a local attorney named Patricia Walshu. He said, had handled several HOA disputes in the area and knew North Carolina HOA law well. He said to mention his name when I called. Not to pressure the attorney, but because she would know the local context and could give me a clear picture of where I stood. I thanked him. He said, don't thank me yet. Just call Patricia tomorrow morning. I did. Patricia Walsh picked up when I called. I mentioned Jamesy's name. She said she knew him well. They had worked together on a city housing initiative several years earlier. She asked me to come in that afternoon. I walked into her office with a full stack of notices, the original violation letter, the HOA handbook, my purchase agreement from 9 years ago, and photographs of the garden bed from multiple angles, including the day it was built. Patricia reviewed everything. She asked precise questions. She took careful notes. Then she said, I want to start with something that may or may not help your situation, but needs to be checked. North Carolina passed legislation in 2013 that specifically limits HOA authority over vegetable gardens. Let me pull the statute. She pulled it up on her computer. She read it. She compared it to the HOA's handbook language. She looked up at me. Their prohibition on front yard agricultural use, she said carefully, may not be enforceable under current North Carolina law. I said, what does that mean for the $15,000? The fines were an administrative hold. The HOA's legal counsel was conducting a review. Patricia and I were in a strong position, and we both knew it. But I want to tell you something that happened during those 3 weeks of waiting that I did not expect. Other residents started coming forward. Not dramatically, not in a coordinated way. Just quietly, one by one, people who had heard what was happening and wanted to share their own experiences with Diane's enforcement style. A woman named Carol Two Streets had been fined $800 for a wind chime that Diane had classified as an unapproved exterior decoration. She had paid it without challenging because she did not know she could challenge it, and the amount felt manageable if painful. A retired couple named the Hendersons had been fined $1,200 over 2 years for a series of minor violations. A garden hose left coiled on the driveway. A holiday wreath left up 3 days past the HOA post-holiday removal deadline. A mailbox that Diane had measured and found to be 2 inches off the approved height. They had paid every fine. They had never complained formally. A young family named the Garcias had been fined $600 for a small basketball hoop in their driveway that their 9-year-old used after school. The HOA handbook prohibited permanent sports equipment in driveways. The Garcias' hoop was portable, rolled in and out as needed, but Diane had cited it anyway. All of these residents had one thing in common. They had all paid. They had all accepted the fines as legitimate, even when they felt unfair, because fighting the HOA felt too complicated, too expensive, too uncertain. Patricia estimated, based on the conversations I was having and passing along to her, that Diane's enforcement activities over the past 3 years had generated somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 in fines from residents who had not known their options. Patricia called the HOA's legal counsel directly with that estimate. She said she wanted them to factor it into whatever recommendation they made to the board. The legal review took 3 weeks. The HOA's own attorney delivered his findings in a written report to the board. The report confirmed what Patricia had argued. North Carolina's Garden Protection Statute, specifically the provisions added in 2013 limiting HOA authority over residential food production, did create a significant legal question about the enforceability of the agricultural use prohibition as it had been applied to my garden bed. The report recommended that the board immediately suspend enforcement of the agricultural use prohibition pending a formal bylaw revision process. It also recommended that all fines issued under that specific violation be reviewed and potentially rescinded. The report said nothing about Diane specifically. It was about the policy. But the board meeting that followed was very much about Diane. Patricia attended that meeting with me. James was there again, in the same third-row seat. This time more residents had come, probably 4 to 5 people in the community room, standing along the walls. Carl presented the legal findings to the community. He was careful and measured. He said the board accepted the attorney's recommendation. The agricultural use prohibition would be suspended. The raised bed height violation, which was a separate issue, legitimately in the handbook and not affected by the state statute, remained. Carl said the board were prepared to rescind all fines related specifically to the agricultural use violation. That was $10,200 of the $15,000 total. The remaining $4,800 related to the height violation. Patricia stood and spoke. She said she appreciated the board's action on the agricultural use fines. She also said she wanted to address the compounding fine schedule more broadly. She pointed out that the HOA's escalating penalty structure, applied over 4 months to a single ongoing violation, had produced a result that most reasonable people would find disproportionate to the violation. She asked the board to consider whether the full $4,800 was an appropriate penalty for a garden bed that was 4 inches too tall. The room was quiet. James raised his hand. He said, "I'd like to suggest that the board consider a proportionality standard for future fines. A penalty schedule that produces $15,000 for a garden bed is going to create legal and reputational risk for this community. I think there's a straightforward revision that would serve everyone better." Carl looked at the board members beside him. There was a brief, quiet exchange. Then Carl said the board would review the penalty schedule as part of a broader governing document revision process, and that in the interim, they were prepared to reduce the remaining height violation fines to $500, representing the initial notice fee only, with all compounding penalties waived. $500, down from $15,000. The room exhaled. Not everyone. A few people near the front, Diane supporters, I assumed, remained expressionless. But most of the room felt the shift. I said yes. Patricia said yes. We shook hands with Carl across the table. "There's one more thing I need to tell you about that meeting." After the formal business was done, Carl announced that the board was also accepting the resignation of the HOA's compliance coordinator, effective immediately, and that a compliance function would be restructured with direct board oversight going forward. He did not say Diane's name. He did not have to. I looked across the room. Diane was not there. She had not attended the meeting. I found out later, from Carol, who knew someone on the board, that Diane had submitted her resignation 3 days after the legal findings were delivered, before the meeting, before the public announcement. She had seen which way this was going. After the meeting, in the parking lot, James stopped beside me for a moment. He said, $500. That acceptable? I said very much yes. He said, "Good garden, by the way, the lavender especially." He went to his car. It is late summer as I write this. The lavender finished blooming about 3 weeks ago and is going to seed in the way lavender does when you let it do what it wants to do. The sunflowers are enormous, taller than I planned, which seems appropriate given everything. The tomatoes are completely out of control in the best possible way. The raised bed is still 16 inches tall. I lowered it. Then I measured it. Then I realized I had lowered it to exactly 12 inches and thought, no, that is not the point of any of this. I raised it back to 16. I sent Patricia a message telling her what I had done and why. She sent back a single word, "Good." The raised bed height violation technically still exists. The fine is $500, paid, done. The agricultural use prohibition has been suspended pending bylaw revision. My tomatoes are growing in a front yard in a North Carolina suburb, 4 inches too high, and nobody is coming to measure them. That feels right to me. James Whitfield is, as of this recording, one of my closest friends in this neighborhood. I want to be careful about how I say that because I do not want it to sound like what it is not. He did not rescue me. He did not use influence or connections to make a phone call and fix my problem. He asked a good question at a meeting, sat quietly while the process worked, and went home and assembled patio furniture. What he did, and this sounds simple but it was not, was be a genuinely decent neighbor. He brought information. He asked the right question at the right moment. He showed up as a resident, not as a former official, and his presence in that meeting room shifted the dynamic not because of authority but because of credibility. He was a person the board knew would not be intimidated and would not stop asking reasonable questions. We have dinner occasionally. His wife, Margaret, makes an extraordinary roast chicken that has ruined me for all other roast chicken permanently. We talk about the neighborhood, about local politics, about whatever is growing in the garden. He asked me once whether I had thought about running for the HOA board. I said absolutely not. He laughed and said he thought that was probably the right answer. The HOA board today is genuinely different from what it was a year ago. Carl is still board president. He is, I have come to believe, a reasonable man who was not well served by the person he had entrusted with compliance enforcement. In the months since the settlement, he has made real efforts to run a more transparent and proportionate operation. The penalty schedule has been revised. Fines now escalate more slowly and cap at a level that a reasonable person would find proportionate to actual violations. The compounding structure that produced $15,000 from a garden bed no longer exists. The agricultural use prohibition is being replaced by a provision that aligns with North Carolina state law, allowing residential vegetable gardens with reasonable aesthetic standards rather than prohibiting them outright. A formal variance process has been publicized to all residents. Multiple people have already used it. 2 of them successfully received exemptions for modifications that would previously have simply triggered automatic violations. Carol's wind chime is back up. I see it when I walk past the house on the way to the mailbox. It sounds exactly like a wind chime should sound. Nobody has filed a complaint. The Henderson family told me at a block party last month that for the first time in 3 years they feel comfortable making decisions about their own property without worrying about what Diane might put in the mailbox. I understood exactly what they meant. That constant low-level anxiety of living under arbitrary enforcement is something you do not fully notice until it is gone and you realize how much space it had been taking up. I want to close this story the way I opened it, with a number, $15,000. That number on that notice felt like a wall. It felt like the end of a road. It felt like something too large and too official to push back against. I sat at my kitchen table with that notice, and for a few hours I genuinely did not know what to do. And then a moving truck pulled up next door. I am not telling you this story because the mayor moved next door. Most of you will not have a former elected official as a neighbor. Most disputes do not turn on the presence of someone with a public profile and a history of asking good questions at meetings. I am telling you this story because of what James actually did, which was not use power. It was use knowledge. He knew about the statute. He asked a question. He showed up. Any resident in that room could have done what James did. Any resident who had taken the time to read Patricia's letter, to look up North Carolina HOA law, to find that statute and understand what it meant, any one of them could have stood up and asked that question. James happened to be the one who did, which means the lesson is not find a powerful neighbor. The lesson is be the person in the room who has done the reading, who knows the statute, who asked the specific, documented, reasonable question that the board cannot dismiss, who shows up not to make a scene but to make a point. You can be that person. Read your state HOA laws. Read your governing documents, all of them, including page 4 to 7. Know what a variance is. Know what your state law permits and prohibits. Know that private HOA rules cannot override public statutes. And if someone puts a $15,000 fine on your door for a garden bed that is 4 inches too tall and has tomatoes in it, do not pay it. Not until you have read the law, because the law may have something very interesting to say. Thank you for watching all 6 parts. If this story helped you, if you are dealing with an HOA situation right now or just want to be better prepared, please subscribe, share this with a neighbor, and leave a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me what your HOA has done that felt wrong. Tell me if you fought back and what happened. I read everything.